Good day, students. This is my third video lecture, and in this particular lecture or video, I will be dealing with the uh, sexual issues or the issue of sexuality in the novel of Mark Twain's The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. The first question that we must ask ourselves is quite naturally, that question will come quite naturally after finishing reading the novel, is that whether or not the question of sexuality or the question of gender or the problematics that such questions pose are in the very first place relevant to this text. Now, there will be a group of critics or scholars or people who will think that since Mark Twain did not intentionally comment upon or decide to write about the sexuality or deal with any issues of sexuality or gender issues in his novel, should we, the readers or critics or scholars for the matter, strive to find out about those issues which are not explicitly there? Now, this is a very common question that arises. However, what we must ask ourselves is that what if we do find some traces of sexual issues or issues that deal or episodes and comments or conversations that deal with the underlying problematics or underlying schematics of gender issues? um, what does it contribute to the study, a critical study of the novel? um, Now, there will be people who will say that those critics or the critics who concentrate upon or who fixate upon or who do want to um, will find out about the underlying problems of gender issues that Mark Twain may explicitly or implicitly ascertain or mark out in the novel. There will be people who saying that these critics, they are trying to read the novel in a way of satisfying their own propaganda, their own gender-sided propaganda. And they will be answered by the fact that if you overlook the issues, which is something that cannot be overlooked, and I will be coming to that, if you overlook these issues, it is your propaganda or your political agenda that you are playing with. So let's begin. The first and very important fact is that Huckleberry Finn has been called, and it's still called, uh, right or wrong, that is a separate question, but it has been called a boy's book. It is about what a true boy is. And since much of the byplay or much of the play within the novel or interpretation of the novel deal with Tom and Huck, we have to acknowledge that that gender roles are very much there in the novel itself, because it is about people and people belonging to different sexes, people belonging to different genders. We will problematize these definitions further. Um, but insofar as it deals with how to become a boy or a boy from adolescence, from a childhood to adolescence to adulthood, the gender issues are clearly there in the novel itself. For the contemporaries of Mark Twain, or at least the readers who responded to the book, they just mentioned the problem that I mentioned, that the problem of a bad boy, the novel that presents a bad boy as its protagonist, it evidently appeared far more central than the problem of race, which, of course, in the eyes of these readers and critics, have been settled in the abolition of slavery years before the novel's publication. So, if uh, the racial issues that we have already dealt with in our lectures or in my lectures, they are they have been absolved, they have been resolved uh, quite some time before, over 100 years before, and therefore those issues that are explicitly over there, and so many critics and so many concerns have been formulated around it, the issue of race has been settled in its entirety, in its legality, and points of views have changed, times have changed. We have come in a time when race is no longer the most prominent, overshadowing issue that hovers above our heads. Now, what is it then? Then was the race theme So if I talk about the race theme, then was the race theme there in the 1880s? Were people concerned about the racial issues at back at the time? Is the bad boys theme still there now, or are both of them are there? These are the questions that we ask ourselves. Now, recent theorists or recent scholarships has shown that, and they've argued that whatever is there in the novel, or the there-ness in any piece of text, is something that we cannot. Yes, as I was saying, that recent critics and recent criticism, as and we are the ones who are in most support of these theorists, because we are aware of so much more than what the people of the 1800s were aware of. And it is not ignorance that I'm hinting at, but the global development that has occurred all around us, that we are in the crux of this ever-changing storm that constantly changes our perspectives of how we look at people, how we look at the world. Categories are no longer singular. There are overlapping categories, so we no longer associate a person bad or a person criminal only because of the religion, or only because of color of the skin. There is a huge political propaganda that backs up such points of view, and we as intellectual people, as scholars of literature, we are the most aware of it now in the 21st century, when such problems are so acute that we can no longer designate a particular race of people, a particular religion of people as bad. And those of us who do, there are intellectuals, truly intellectuals or academicians, they will always be opposing these kind of views, because what we read about in our literature is not one singular, and what we read about in our literature, and most importantly what we gain from it, is not does not exist in isolation, does not exist as a singular phenomenon. And we are aware of the interlocking of these phenomenons. We understand that, well, as Barth has said, that it is a tissue of quotations, that one text is interlinked with so many hundreds and thousands of texts that there is no end to it. There is no end to the interpretations. There is no end to the open-endedness of any particular work of art. So therefore, whether or not an issue is there in the novel, explicit in the novel, in this novel, that is, or in any work of literature, the there-ness of any object of study is not marked or is not made important by the author's interest, is not made important by its explicitness, but quite contradictorily, in the interests and in my interpretative powers. So if I am interested in sieving out the gender issues from a novel which does not explicitly deal with it, then it is my responsibility, or I am accountable for proving it right. And therefore so many criticisms have arisen with the recent gender issues dealt in the novel. So what we can effectively say is that what we tend to look out for in a work of art, or for anything for the matter, um, whenever we look at a person, a painting, a house, a pet, a dog, a species of animal, a piece of literature, a poem, a novel, a drama, whatever we tend to look at, whatever interests us, is actually fueled by the way that we are educated, and in larger term by our culture. And that is what it is for Huckleberry Finn as well, because if the gender issues, if gender issues or juvenile gender issues are not gender issues or racial issues were not discussed by Twain's contemporaries at that point of time, it is not because they were not there explicitly or implicitly, does not matter, but because it was not the cultural atmosphere of that point of time to attack inherent racial issues present in a novel. You see that, and that is precisely why the book at that point of time was attacked and became controversial, not because of the racial issues that it dealt with, but because of the American white boy and the way that he was portrayed, and that it would have been a poor influence on the children who might come across this piece of work. So it is not because of the race issues. I'm talking about Twain's contemporaries over here and not the later critics, of course. So it is not because it was not explicit or implicit in that at that point of time or in that text. It is because the culture of that time, the culture of 1880s, the culture of pre-Reconstruction or just post-Reconstruction America, did not entail or did not demand such an analysis from a text. So when Macbeth and Lady Macbeth debate whether murdering King Duncan is a manly or unmanly thing to do, Shakespeare's play can be said to be opening questions of manliness or womanliness for the audience. Now, this is not to say that Macbeth is a feminist play, although there have been criticisms regarding this particular aspect as well. But it shows only that like other works that deal with relations of the sexes, it invites gender analysis. Because if you are writing a book in which if you're writing a piece of work, whatever it is, and if there are people in it, then there will be the two sexes that the people can be categorized into. And if there are sexes in a book or in a piece of work, there will obviously be an invitation for gender analysis. Now, the objection that reading a Macbeth or Huckleberry Finn in such a way as to emphasize issues of gender, this involves a misdirection of the reader's proper attention to the interests of advancing the critic's propaganda. This is what some people will say. So if you are looking for gender issues in Macbeth or in Huckleberry Finn, there will be critics or scholars who will be saying there can be the point of view that you are advancing your own gender-sided propaganda. And I will be dealing with one such particular essay which makes this point. And there I will also be dealing with essays that say something otherwise, that contribute substantially to the gender discussion of the novel. So, so even if you decide, so even if we can validly come to this conclusion that while Mark Twain was writing the adventures of Huckleberry Finn and including the episode dealing with Mrs. Loftus, Judith Loftus, the scene where Huck dresses up as a girl and goes to and goes to her visit her, well, just comes across Judith Loftus, who is a stranger in the novel, stranger to Huck in the novel. While you may say that Twain did not include that episode in the novel in order to highlight the extent gender issues that were prevalent or would be prevalent, but you can say, but you as a reader, or we as readers or scholars or critics, we might say that we might or might is a wrong word, it will be very correct of us to say that that episode does bring into the light, bring into the forefront the underlying gender issues, and that is not any sort of an imposition. So there will be people who will be saying that well, and there is of course the I'm sorry there is of course the topic about homosexuality, the relationship that uh, Jim and Huck share with each other. There is of course an inevitable discussion that surrounds that particular relationship. So critics will be saying that it is just innocent innocent love between a man and a man, and there will be critics who will be attacking this innocence as like innocence as opposed to what? Is homosexuality criminal? Then why does it have to be innocent? Why do you have to use such an adjective at all? So these are the issues that we will be dealing in details in this particular video lecture. And if this video becomes too long, I will be well publishing or posting another video that will be dealing with homosexuality particularly. Now let us deal with the women in the novel, women in the Huckleberry Finn. You see, if you look at the way that you have been taught this novel, that is by me, you will see that most of my interests or most of the part that I have concentrated upon is the race issue. Now, the race issue is one of the most prominent motifs in the novel, one of the most prominent leaf in this tree that you can pluck out and examine. But it also reflects the fact that so much less attention has been paid to the development of the woman characters in the novel. And that, of course, generates your reading or my reading as well. But we have to analyze all the aspects that there are in the novel, and as such, dealing with the women characters or how Mark Twain deals with it particularly becomes an important point of analysis. So, one of the several novels that are commonly thought to address formation of American attitudes and values, as Huckleberry Finn has been called one of the greatest American novels ever, it is primarily, and it is also a classic in the American literary tradition. Huckleberry Finn is indeed a male novel in several senses. The narrative voice, the specific point of view, or the point of view from which the story is told, from which the events are narrated, is that of a young boy. Moreover, if we concentrate, if we talk about the genre of the novel again, it is a Bildungsroman, which is evidently and traditionally a journey of a boy from passing the various stages of his life, that is from boyhood to adolescence to adulthood. I'm sorry. So historically, the political and physical experiences of exploring and then settling with a wilderness that have required power to initiate and lead social movements. All of these have and that all of these have been commonly granted to men rather than movement. This is the history, this is a factual history, that movements or rebellions or revolutions or the events that have led to these social movements, they have always been granted to men rather than to women. So in the in mythic terms, the typical American hero has, like Huck, resisted the civilizing of efforts of women and has struck out boldly, often like an icon for a new territory. So he stands as a representative of this kind of people, who is also a universal American archetypal hero, as somebody who runs away from the civilizing efforts and those efforts that come from women. Now, there is a critic called Fetterly. I will be just writing his quotation. Now, Judith Fetterly says that America is female and to be American is male, and the quintessential American experience is betrayal by a woman. Now, this is in line with a global phenomenon which is not just restricted to America. But we can say that since America's burgeoning, growing global power, we can say that it is one of the biggest sources of such a sentiment, of sources of having having the inducing capability of such a sentiment, is that uh, the exploitation of land has come to be seen as analogous to as exploitation of women. See, we call the land a motherland. It is a she that it is. The moon is a she. The planets are she. They are all genderized. They are all effeminated. And the fact that it is a male-dominated society that we live in, it is the men who exploit the motherland. It is the men who exploit the moon, exploiting the resources that our Mother Earth gives to us. So even though it would not be accurate to say that Huckleberry Finn in this novel is betrayed by a woman, however, Miss Watson's decision to sell Jim down the river, it is certainly a betrayal of Jim, who is again a man. It sets the novel in motion. The fact that Miss Watson is a woman, and the fact that Clemens or Mark Twain has to have a woman to initiate this situation, to initiate the crisis in the novel, the first crisis in the novel that sets the entire story or narration in motion. It is a woman, and that is Miss Watson. And were it not for the relationship between the slave or between Jim and Huck, much of Twain's commentary would be impossible. And Miss Watson's action allows their relationship to develop, making her a vital element of the plot. So if she had not decided to sell Jim and go against her word in that, maybe this entire motion would not have been set outright in the very first place at all. Even the controversial role of Tom Sawyer plays in the last 7 chapters, or in the later part of the last half of the novel, it centers around the conflict between Tom's romantic givings, the way he romanticizes the world around him, and Huck's tenuous moral supremacy. Huck's growth of moral conscience, as opposed to Tom's static, juvenile, or romantic ideas about the world. This is essentially a conflict between a boy's games and an adult's responsibility. And these adult responsibilities, as I have mentioned already before, these adult responsibilities, they come from the face, or from the hands, or from the existence, or from the inclusion of the women in the novel. It is the women in the novel who make efforts to morally change or incline Huck towards each and any one of their own belief system, whether it be the societal belief, or the Christian belief, or the religious belief, but it always comes from women. And the fact that the women in the novel that Twain portrays, they are no less than any stock characters, typical characters of the time, that they allow no room for interpretation, that they allow no room for play. And those few women in the novel who are not mere stereotypes, such as the character of Judith Loftus and Mary Jane Wilkes, whom Tom meets later in the novel, have more to do with the Huck's development than it is normally acknowledged. Finally, there is Huck's ambivalence about women, Huck's confusion about women, the way that he deals with women whom he tends to view as either nagging or paragons, or just exemplifying the best virtues ever. Now, these virtues that Huck begins to develop, they are usually designated to be as feminine virtues, according to Nancy Walker. However, she characterizes Huck as fleeing from the female virtues he has struggled so hard to attain. Huck never struggles. We can also say that we can contradict her statement by like this, that we have already stated before, that Huck never struggles for any virtues, to attain any kind of virtues, unless unless one counts, unless if you are saying that he struggles to keep himself washed of any sin, that he says towards the end of the novel, that he wants to be washed clean of sin, if you consider that to be a virtue, by betraying Jim, that is. But that is not a virtue. So Huck, we can just safely say that Huck never struggles to gain any kind of virtue whatsoever. So his struggle is always for survival, and his halting, half-conscious, partly revocable moral education comes from a result of his finding himself swirled inside a vortex of storm. Whatever developments that he grows within himself, it is because of the stormy circumstances in which we find him again and again tangled within. So if Huck is trying to get free from any sort of conscience whatsoever, as we have already established, it is also from virtues that he is running from. He is not specifically looking or striving to attain any sort of virtue at all, as he is not striving to or struggling to develop any kind of conscience at all either. Now, this kind of view of woman as a reformer of the society, as the only sex that can be said to emanate virtue from their from their being present around people who would lack those said virtues. This view of woman as a reformer was not very uncommon. A woman as a reformer and a man as brutish was not very unique to Twain or uncommon to the time to which he belonged. You see, during the Victorian period, the clergymen, the middle class women, and the Protestant ministers, they turned simultaneously to the potential matriarchal virtues of nurture, generosity, and acceptance. Like as the churches collapsed in their power, as they were no longer the governing authority of the society, they looked towards women or matriarchal values to instill the virtues which the church would have taught, and looked for a responsibility among women to carry on their work. However, both these groups, that is the ministers, the clergy, and the women, they felt they were powerless, because you see, the work of the economical activities that which brought you food, that which brought money, it was slowly shifting from agriculture to the factory, as with industrial revolution. Um, and and the economic activities were no longer concentrated in the household, and they were moving to the factory. And the clergymen were of course powerless, because the church was de-established, and therefore it it adopted a policy of moral persuasion of others by influence. That is, you will influence somebody else, and that somebody else will influence you in turn. This in turn again resulted in the further objectification or further domination uh, of the woman, as women remained powerless in the real sense. And this circumstantially coincided with the fact that there grew evidently efforts to dominate them, to oppress them. The cruelest aspect of this process of oppression is that the logic by which it forces its objects to be oppressive in turn, to do the dirty work for them. That is, if the women were objectified and the women were oppressed by the women, which was coincided with the powerlessness of the women in the household, as men more and more moved to the factories, away from their visual stance, away from their visual scape, away from the household, from the walls of the family. Um, and what happened is that there was an expectation of the women to do certain kinds of dirty work from the men. And especially this dirty work especially involved in straightening wayward boys who went wayward or away from the word of God, as we see Miss Watson and Aunt Sally constantly trying to intricate or teach Huck in the lessons of the Bible. But whatever it is, whatever the fact or historical fact may be, however Mark Twain wanted to satirize or write in an ironical fashion or using humor, however hard he tried to satirize the middle class respectability of the women and the men in the novel, we might come to a very safe conclusion that the women characters in the novel play for the most part a very positive role in Huck's character development, particularly alongside that of Jim. For apart from Jim, which whom do we have who what male characters do we have in the novel, upon whom we can rest the responsibility of morally developing Huck uh, as a boy to adolescent and then to adulthood? Pap, the first person. This is Pap for you. And look at how the son describes his father. Look at how he says that he looks like the devil white, as if he has no feeling within himself. However, it is also not true that all men in the novel are recklessly violent. However, we can again safely say that except Jim, it is only Jim, it is only in the character of the Jim that we can truly say that we see that hints of maturity and virtue. Whereas we have characters like Uncle Silas Phelps, who is also again a stereotype of the bumbling and oppressed husband, that is a topic of so many gender jokes. We have Tom Sawyer, who is the stereotypical classic bad boy, who turns from a youthful prankster early in the novel, to a kind of malicious torturer during the farcical freedom freeing of Jim adventure, which we have already established was not necessary in the very first place, because it was a trick that he pulled in order to make his personal adventure a success. And this is absolutely true for Jim, because Jim is the only male character that has a positive influence upon Huck. Jim chooses a mid path, and he is not overtly moralistic, neither is he a criminal. You see, quite ironically, Huck's greatest sin, as he himself claims, is of helping a slave escape, which is also the greatest sin that Jim commits. That is, running away from Miss Watson. These are the greatest sins that these two accept themselves to have committed. Whereas these are the actual things, or these are exactly the points, or these are actually the virtues that Twain wants the readers, or Twain wants Huck and Jim to be in agreement with. So apart from Jim, there are only the women characters, in contrast to all the male characters in the novel. Apart from Jim, it is only the female characters that largely conform to the society. And it is expected of them, Mark Twain expects that this conformity is the source of their flat and stereotypical portrayal. The fact that Mark Twain presents the women characters as the only people in the novel who conform to the societal values, as we see time and again they try to educate Huck in those moralistic principles as well. It is precisely because of this that Mark Twain disallows them, or never allows them, to deviate from the social norms, that they become stock characters, that they become very typical, that they are stereotyped. Now let's begin with the first character that first of the characters that have positive influences on Huck. The most obvious reformers of Huck Finn are, of course, the widow Douglas and Miss Watson, and then to some extent Aunt Sally Phelps, that we come across later in the novel. The widow and Miss Watson are, of course, Huck's unofficial guardians at the beginning of the novel, and it is their insistence on prayers and clothes that make Huck feel all cramped up. Of course, we have already analyzed Huck's want of absolute freedom from these crampedness, from these impositions of societal virtues on himself. But these are the virtues in which he feels cramped up, and he has to feel himself cramped up in order for Mark to realize his true manhood, that is the running away from the women characters who impose virtues upon them, as we will see that even biographically, or even in the real life of Mark Twain, he himself wanted to come free from the imposing attitudes, or from the impositions of the women around in his life. Now they represent, that is widow Douglas, the widow, the Aunt Sally, and Miss Watson. They represent the three most popular images of women in the 19th century, but they are all different. They cannot be brought under a similar umbrella. The key to the differences among these three female characters is, of course, their marital status. No matter, however, how devoutly some women of the time clung to the state of single blessedness, or they wanted themselves to be confirmed spinsters, marriage was the only widely sanctioned state of adulthood. So, if you are not married, and if you are a spinster, and however you are comfortable with it, the society would never accept you as an adult, or the society would never say that you have stepped into the boots of adulthood unless you are married. Widows, that is the category under which widow Douglas can be fallen upon. The widows had somewhat better time of it than spinsters, in the public eye, as it was pointed out by a famous humorist of the time, Helen Rowland. She said that even a dead husband gives a widow some advantage over an old maid. Now, that is very true. The spinster, who is presumed to be unwanted, is also presumed to have been ossified. She is somebody who is unimportant. The image of the widow, on the other hand, who was at one time a wife and probably a mother, is somewhat softer, even a reformer. She has a kinder heart. The married woman, assumed to be proper in a proper element, that the, being married is the proper state to be, is the correct state to be, and therefore the married woman provides the most contented image of the three, and thus she is likely to become the greatest reformer of all of these three people. And under this category we can of course of course call in upon the character of Aunt Sally Phelps of the Phelps farm. So, if we come to the character, or if we closely analyze the character of, or the role that Miss Watson has in the novel, you see that from the perspective of Huck, or even as Miss Watson is portrayed, because everything or every person in the novel is analyzed or is first seen or described from Huck's point of view, for the matter. And so therefore we can say, if we say that Miss Watson is the most nagging of all the women characters in the novel. She is the person who disturbs or who irritates Huck the most. She is the person from whom Huck wants to run away the most and the fastest from. She is the person who constantly delimits Huck and always wants him to be proper, even though Huck never wants it to be. And it is also, and in the matter of religion, it is also Miss Watson that Huck learns a lot from. It is that she says that the heaven that she describes to him, it is very unappealing. She said that she told Huck, in the particular speech, that whatever you have to do in paradise all day is to harp and sing forever and dance forever. And Huck did not feel much for it. The subject of heaven is one of the several on which Huck distinguishes between the widow Douglas and Miss Watson. And therefore, and we can safely conclude that the views that Miss Watson has upon religion, can be associated with her prolonged spinsterhood. It is very Puritan. It is a very Calvinistic religious view of providence, in which you can achieve heaven or paradise only by the good deeds on earth and nothing. And as such, Huckleberry is far from achieving paradise, because he is the worst of the lot according to him, and also as we can see. And therefore, in the matter of religion, it is from Miss Watson that Huck learns a very valuable lesson, and it is also in the point of religion that Huck distinguishes uh, evidently between Miss Watson and the widow Douglas. And although and even if we but in spite of this fact, uh, Huck's relationship with Miss Watson is positively influential. For when we find that in the episode where Tom Sawyer just makes up a story and makes up a game where the family of each person has to be killed. Of course, it is a game that they are playing. Huck offers up Miss Watson. The fact that he does offers her up has two implications. First, that he perhaps hates her the most, and the second is that whatever she does to him, or whatever he despises about her, Huck does consider Miss Watson to be a family. And even though at first Huck refuses, or Huck is afraid of sending Jim back to Miss Watson, because she will be super angry at him, and she will and he does and Huck does not know what Miss Watson might just end up doing. Later on, as his conscience develop, we find that um, Miss that he is I'm sorry that he is quite disturbed by the fact of stealing Miss Watson's property. Now, this particular statement we have already analyzed before, so I'm not going to go into that again. But he does say that, and from this perspective, he does think about Miss Watson as somebody who has had a positive influence over her, without which he could not have thought about her in a selfless fashion as he does. And as for the widow Douglas, he does not resent or pity the widow as he does Miss Watson. He's very quick to excuse the widow's behavior towards him. It is precisely because the widow's method of reforming is is by requesting or explaining rather than scolding or nagging or imposing, and the latter which Miss Watson effectively and continuously does. She nags and she imposes upon him, which Huck does not want, and Huck would prefer a widow Douglas to Miss Watson any time, because the widow's methods involves requesting and explanations of things and why you should do what you should do. She merely does not quote the Bible and say that you have to do this, that this is fundamental for you in order to achieve heaven. But the widow explains to him in a systematic fashion so that Huck may ingrain the teachings within himself in a better norm. As we know that Huck is a kind of a boy who analyzes the perspectives of everybody around him and then comes to a valid conclusion, that is his own decision making. So, on one hand, where Huck dismisses the reforming attitudes or the reforming capabilities of Miss Watson quite sharply, he accepts the widow's reforming measure. He quite misses the way that he would treat her, and he loves the fact that he loves the praises that he receives from the widow, and we can quite associate it with parenting. You see, a parent or a child who is subjected to physical abuse. By physical abuse, I do not mean any sexual abuse, but flogging, hitting, slapping, whatever it is. A child responds in today's modern theory, even in today's modern theory, it is quite acceptable that a child does not respond very well to that. So the widow's method is far more acceptable to Huck, of course, and it is. And one of the most important reasons that one of the most important lesson that the widow teaches Huck is that it is possible for a person to think of another human being's welfare before his own. So not only has the widow taken the vagrant boy Huck into her home, she has also demonstrated that she cares about him, that his escapades do not make her ashamed, do not make her angry, but sad. And when Huck responds favorably to the widow's efforts to change his behavior and attitudes and values, he does so because he realizes that his actions have an effect on others as well. And it is this same principle that motivates Huck's final decision to help Jim escape, if we can put it like that, regardless of the consequences for himself. It is because the widow has taught her to think about somebody else's welfare before your own, not to be selfish. And as he is struggling with his conscience, he recalls the good times that Jim had. Later, uh, when he visualizes, or when he is very close to the potential, when he is very close to actually helping Jim escape, and the conscience struck him, and he wants to expose himself, or wants to expose the fugitive slave to Miss Watson. He writes a letter to her, and it is also at this moment when he recalls the good moments that he and Jim had on the raft, and this realization of his responsibility for another human being, Huck builds upon the example the widow has set for him. It is because of the widow's reforming techniques that Huck has begun to think about somebody else, think about the welfare of somebody who is not himself. He surpasses the widow in the moral integrity, even by recognizing a black man as a fellow human being. So that is what education should do to you. Education must never impose upon you. Education must open to you the choices that you have. The only positive thing that education does to you is build up your intellect. And intellect, my students, it is not a very polished word as it seems. Intellect is just your capacity to make a good decision, to distinguish between a good decision and a bad decision. And education gives you that proper intellectual outcome so that you can defend your intellectual decisions as well. If we imagine the kind of influence that the widow would have exerted upon Huck if he were to be staying with her for a longer period of time, uh, we could see that there are certain positive moral implications. However, it is precisely the point that feminist critics would make, that it is Twain's characterization of making the women characters stock and typical and static and never dynamic at all that prevents us from further analysis of the effects that that these women might have had on the text or on the character of Huck per se. And as I had mentioned a little before, that we will see that even in his own life, Twain had a similar view about women. I am going to quote a little bit from what he says about his wife in one of his biographies. Now this is a particular character trait that we can also witness is one in one of the other women characters who has had somewhat a positive influence upon Huck, but the least, that is to say. And this is in and the portrayal of Aunt Sally of the Aunt Sally Phelps of the Phelps farm is in line with how he views even his own wife as well, taking a dive from taking a dive comic into a comic figure in such descriptions. And Aunt Sally becomes comic, and so Aunt Sally becomes comic and non-threatening even as she attempts to discipline Tom and Huck. And most of the time Aunt Sally's threats are idle, of course, when she wants to whip them, for example, when she wants to hit them, for example. But but even when she punishes the boys, it has very little effect, as we can see from the episode when Tom and Huck they manage to free a bunch of snakes inside the house of Sally Phelps of the Phelps. And Sally licks them. But however, this licking or this hitting or beating do not have much of an effect on much of an effect on the boys at all. uh, Whereas on the other hand, for the widow Douglas, Huck him by himself took the initiative that he would try to, within quotes, behave a while, if possible, so as to please. And as such, we can understand that Mark Twain's view of women as reformers of young men, it was more so of a product of his own youthful fantasy, formed in part of a Victorian culture in which he was living and in which his contemporaries were also living. And in an attempt to claim the legitimate, if somewhat ineffectual, as we do see that the reforming effects of these women are in conclusion ineffectual upon Huck and even Tom, authority and self-esteem in a society that had made them powerless was one of the primary or understandings, or one of the Victorian women willingly acceded to the cult of motherhood, because they were denied responsibility, they were denied accountability on any other grounds. You have to understand that the Victorians in the Victorian society, the women, they were restricted to the household, to the kitchen, to the life of the family, to making sure that the members of the family are treated well and fed well, and other people outside of the family treat them well as well. And this is what the cult of the motherhood is all about. And Mark Twain, as a product of the society that essentially gives rise to this kind of a stereotype, was also a part of this culture from which he could not, even if he wanted to, run away from. So, what growth Huck does achieve comes largely, we may say that comes largely from his perception of qualities in others that he wishes to assume himself with the exception of Jim, of course. All of the positive of the qualities that he assumes within himself come from women, even though we can contradict that fact, as I have said earlier. And therefore, in addition to the widow Douglas, we have Mrs. Judith Loftus and also Mary Jane Wilkes into this category. Both of these characters, that is Judith Loftus and Mary Jane Wilkes, are more than mere stereotypes, and both of them demonstrate intelligence and courage that Huck does not find in most of the men he knows. Mrs. Loftus, for example, primarily her advice at this point of whenever we find her in the novel, her advice at that point was is the practical sort that Huck needed for survival, and Huck perceives her as strong and intelligent. More importantly, Huck more important than this is that Mrs. Loftus confirms Huck in his maleness early in the novel. Not only does she quickly see through Huck's female disguise, but she also outlines for him the male behavior that has betrayed him. He outlines for She is the first person in the novel who methodically, verbally, and visually teaches or advises Huck upon how to behave like a man, and that is why that episode becomes the center of much more discussion regarding the gender issues that is dealt with in the novel. And this particular scene or setting or the dialogue or the conversation that Loftus and Huck exchange is one of the keys, one of the very important scene that obviously will discusses about implicitly discusses about the gender issues that we can make out from the novel. So if Huck, who is even being a white American free man, free boy, who belongs to the lowest rung of even his class, whom we essentially call the American white trash. He is uneducated, he is uncivilized, he prefers being barefoot to wearing shoes, he prefers using cuss words, he prefers smoking pipes, and as such, him running away from the society which wants to restrain and constrain him is actually a development of his own individual integrity, his own individualism. The fact that he does not want to belong to any class or the constructs of any particular class, they add to the development of his own integrity. And whatever that is, whatever that builds up or whatever that contributes to the building of male integrity, being unfeminine, not being feminine, is one of the primary or fundamental keys in order to build up your or one's male integrity. And motherly Judith Lofter, who is in command in the scene and of Huck, but is most unexpectedly she is in command of herself, making this explicit when she takes the command of the house itself, into which Huck has penetrated in the disguise of a female. Though through his inept rendering of through his unsuccessful rendering of girliness, she analyzes female behavior as if from the outside, objectively, as if she does not belong to that sex at all. As Huck as when he stands apart from his white trash ignorance, or Jim briefly from his black superstition. They are similar, as Jim who stands apart from his superstition as an individual, as Huck who stands separate from the white trash philosophy or theory as an individual. So does Judith Loftus stand as an individual when she views or gazes at Huck as if outside from the gender constructs. The precision with which Mrs. Loftus describes how a girl does through very necessarily implies equal knowledge about men or the males of how boys do it as well. She can detail femininity because she sees it essentially as a role that anyone can play, that anyone can perform, and even that and even for that matter, masculinity is a role also. The logic of this is that anyone who knows how to play the role can be a man or a woman. Now, even if this sounds somewhat far-fetched, we are going to accept this perspective for some time, and then we are going to see a counter perspective at all after this as well. So the culminating moment in the reversal of this sexuality or femininity from nature to nurture, that is, of course, we may easily bring in Beauvoir's statement that a woman is not born but made. It is a construct. Gender is a construct. Sex is natural. You are born with certain biological elements or biological characteristic features upon you, upon your body, that characterize you as a male or a female, as a female or a female. That is sex for you, a male or a female. That is completely biological, that is completely physical, that is something that you can touch, see, and experience as well. But the concept of gender, that is feminine or masculine, what do these mean? Masculine means ছেলেদের মতন, feminine means মেয়েদের মতন. This comparative analysis that we bring in the description of gender makes it a construct. So if you are like a woman, like a female, you are feminine, even if you do have the physical traits biologically that of a male, and the opposite is also true. So this culminating moment in the reversal of femininity from nature to nurture, from sex to gender, comes toward the end of the episode. After warning Huck not to go among women pretending to be one of them, Judith also adds kindly, you that he does a girl tolerably poor, but of course he might be able to fool men. This is the final blow, not to male authority but to the authority of gender itself. For if women recognize femininity better than men, then that can only mean that femininity is a performance and not a natural mode of being. Now, this view also leads this particular critic, Myra Jalen, to make this comment that femininity as an act or femininity as a feature reveals itself equally to men and women. And since in the society which is dominated by men, it is men who decide the codes, or it is men who decide the tenets, the points, or the convergences, or the particular features that effeminate a person irrespective of their sex. Now, here lies the problem, and here lies the justification of the statement that gender is essentially a social construct, whereas sex is not. And sex and gender are two very different words with two very, very significantly different meaning. And these role reversals in which slightly occurs in this novel, which we have so often seen in plays of Shakespeare, which we quite ironically find in so many movies of the modern times, very recent movies, where we have found such role reversals of sex and of course then gender. But then again, in the latter part is the problem lies, because gender as a construct is codified by men who do not want it to be seen in their own sexes. Do you understand? As a man, as a male person does not want, a male sex does not want to have feminine qualities in himself because he will be ostracized, does not want his male son, his male boy or male child to have effeminate qualities because he will be ostracized and marginalized by the society. So these two are very different things. The effeminacy and a female, the masculinity or immaculation or a male. But Twain was quite aware of these problematics as well. However, he could not. It is not revealing to us because he could not finish the work which primarily dealt with role reversals. However, I would like you to just do a simple Wikipedia search of Hellfire Hotchkiss. Hellfire Hotchkiss. This is an unfinished novel of which Twain only wrote 3 pages of it, and I would like you to incorporate relate to this unfinished novel into this answer if you are making an answer out of the gender issues in the novel. And thus we come to the last endearing female character in the novel, who has last in the sense, so last one to have a positive influence on the character development or the moral development of Huck, and that is of Mary Jane Wilkes. Now she is a peculiar, or she is an atypical character, female character in the novel, in the sense that his Huckleberry admires her for the two qualities that she has, that is grit and sand. Now these are the two things that you do not naturally associate. Again, it is not a question of right and wrong. I'm talking about factualities, historical facts. These are the qualities that you do not usually associate with a female, with a feminine person. So these qualities attract Huck the most, as she is the only person who has the willingness to take a decision and the capacity and the strength to abide by that decision. And For this, Huck is in admiration of Mary Jane Wilkes. But his contact with these, and so these, his contact with all these women has also confirmed the fact that he is also male. You see, as more and more you are confronted, or you come into identification of the opposite sex and the gender which which it represents and the constructs which it represents, you yourself want to include yourself either in that construct or the other. So Huck wants to include himself in the other construct, and that is of the masculine, and therefore he must remove himself from the spheres of these influencing women, or he perceives as female world of conformity, as Mark Twain draws them up to be. And with the widow Douglas and Miss Watson, he plays the part of the unruly boy. With Judith Loftus, he tries to be a girl and fails. And with Mary Jane Wilkes, he assumes the role of a male protector and of female innocence. Finally, with Jim, he arrives a mature relationship, a friendship with another man, one for whom he is prepared to risk eternal damnation, as he would often say that he would very well go to hell rather than expose Jim. But his agreement, his acquiescence to the adolescent behavior of Tom Sawyer in the final chapters demonstrates just how fragile these maturity has been, and that it has actually not reached its developmental peak. And as it is, and as his desire, as we are confronted with his desire to light out for the territory, is we do somewhat realize that this is just youthful escapism, in which he essentially wants to run away from the adult life of responsibility, which also entails inclusion of women. So in conclusion, I would like to say that even though we can portray, or we may very rightfully portray the female characters to be having a very positive moral influence and conscious influence upon Huck, where do this influence take him from or take him to? Influence, positive or negative, must push you towards acting something that is out of what you usually do. Only then you can make out that influence of somebody who is not you, an external influence, a force. That is a force in physical science, like it is an external force that exerts, or that imposes an object to move. So if that influence is an external force, and if the object is Huck, then where is he to move, or from what? Is he to move from the antebellum South, from the enslaved South, from his class, from the class which he belongs to? Then to what? Which characters or which people should he idealize? His father? No. Judge Thatcher? No. His father? Definitely no. Judge Thatcher, the Gangerfords, the Shepherd's Sons, the Duke, the Duke and his assistant, they are all criminalized. They are all presented to us. So if we are thinking in terms of the text itself, they are all presented to us who cannot, or who should not have, except for Judge Thatcher, of course, who should not have any, or Mr. Phelps, that is, should not have any positive influence on Huck, because these are the qualities that we do not want to see in a dignified, adult, mature, and consciously developed moral character that Huck is. Having the experience and seeing the things that he has seen, Huck cannot abide by the rules of any of these characters. And it is only because of this that it is Jim, and only Jim, with whom he grows a particular and a familiar, a filial bond, a bond of pure friendship, a bond that will last, and a bond for which he is willing to sacrifice his life, or his life of pure innocence, and achieve eternal damnation. Now there will be another, I will try to post another video regarding the homosexual aspects of the novel. However, if I am not able to do so, I will be sending you a very important essay, a single essay, and that will be sufficient, I think. However, let's see if I can post it, and please come up with questions if you have anything to ask. These are more or less all of the views that exist upon the gender dealings in the novel, and if I do come across anything else, and if I do think that there is something else important to be conveyed to you, I will definitely share them with you. Thank you very much.